friends, I hope you're doing well. Welcome back to Cake Over Keto, your non-diet podcast that stands up against diet culture so you can make peace with food in your body and eat the goddamn cake without anxiety and guilt. I am Mel Wakeman, registered nutritionist, intuitive eating practitioner, non-diet counsellor and lover of coffee cake. I specialise in disordered eating and recovering from chronic dieting, eating disorder recovery and body dissatisfaction, all through a weight-inclusive health at every size lens. I am here to provide a safe healing space for those on their way to food and body freedom, with episodes every 2 weeks. I will mention body weight in this episode, but don't talk about specifics in terms of numbers. I mention the O word, but there will always be context. But for this episode, listener discretion is advised. So thank you if you're staying, put that kettle on, find a comfy seat and sit with me for around 20 minutes. And while the kettle boils, if you'd like to find me on social media, please do. I'm on Instagram and now TikTok at Cake Over Keto. Keep your ears plugged in. What's coming up in this episode is right around the corner. In this episode, I'll be talking honestly about weight loss surgery. Now, this is not something I've considered personally or been offered, but I have supported folk who have. So this is the perspective I'm coming from. I provide education without judgment while still offering a space to find body acceptance. And I understand to a certain extent, because I have not experienced this, why people want weight loss surgery. Because it's much easier to live in this world in a smaller body. I've spoken before in previous episodes about my thin privilege. I can access clothes that fit. I can afford to buy clothes that fit. I have not been on the receiving end of weight stigma at work or when trying to access healthcare. I can fit into aeroplane seats and on roller coaster rides. I can get MRI scans and have my blood pressure checked when needed. Anti-fat bias is rife in healthcare. So no, this world does not make it easy for everybody to take up the space they are entitled to. So when I think about weight loss surgery being offered as a quote unquote choice, is it really? Is it really a choice when it carries such high risks? Or is it a trap? When it carries complications and harms that are not adequately disclosed, yet huge promises are made, a new lease on life through improving self-esteem and self-worth, apparently. It can give you a newfound confidence and control over life that has had issues with being overweight for a long time. But does it? So this is what I want to talk about today, for folk to make a fully informed choice. You need the facts. I'm going to talk about the elephants in the room, which are serious side effects, the sacrifices you'll need to make, and the challenges that will remain for the rest of your life, because these aren't talked about enough. Reported mortality rates for people undergoing weight loss surgery are as high as 5% of patients dying within a year. The actual rate may be even higher due to underreporting, in part because surgical complications aren't reported or logged after 30 days. And a significant number of people considering weight loss surgery may have an eating disorder. An existing eating disorder can make the outcome of surgery worse, and the surgery itself may create conditions that cause or mimic eating disorders or disordered eating. But as much as weight loss surgery is not something I would recommend at all, it is also not my decision. Body autonomy is a human right, but you need all the information to make decisions over your own life and future. So buckle up, we're going in. Weight loss surgery, of which there are multiple variants, known collectively as bariatric surgery, involves making changes to the digestive tract, the gut, so the stomach and or the intestines, to help someone lose weight. And it's a huge cash cow. It's predicted the bariatric surgery market will exceed $4.8 billion by 2028. It's a ginormous operation. Now, I don't have any sort of similar UK data specifically, but there are something like 6,000 to 7,000 surgeries performed here each year. And there's a lot of pressure from this industry, as well as society in general. They want to sell you on the surgery. Ka-ching. So why would they go into the side effects? And here's the thing, the main rationale for offering weight loss surgery apparently is the increasing rate of obesity in adults due to excessive intake of calories and changing lifestyle habits. And I have a problem with this because it pathologizes and shames folk in bigger bodies. It feeds into the rhetoric that folk get fat through eating too much and not doing enough exercise. They are unhealthy and thus a burden on society, and weight can be controlled through willpower. So if a person is fat, then is due to poor lifestyle habits. I mean, come on. What isn't considered are genetics, weight stigma, both external and internal, I'll come back to that, environmental limitations, childhood experiences, trauma, and using food as a coping strategy through difficult times, which is human. And what I mean by weight stigma here is the negative weight-related attitudes and beliefs that manifest as stereotypes for fat folk, rejection, prejudice, discrimination towards individuals of higher weights. Much of this is externally driven, but is often internalized, which is where I think it causes a lot more harm and is difficult to shift. So can we acknowledge that high levels of internalized weight stigma are associated with high levels of all the diseases that are blamed on size? And in fact, they're much more likely to be caused by or influenced by weight stigma rather than weight alone. Yet both the medical community and wider society continue to hold on to the belief that a higher weight causes poor health. Cue more weight stigma. Yet the data does not and cannot support this link. For example, the risk of mortality is lowest for people with body mass indexes between 25 to 30. Now, most of the criteria for bariatric surgery focus on a patient having a body over a certain size, which is assessed by body mass index, having a history of failed weight loss attempts, and a lack of psychological contraindications, which are not actually well defined. And eating disorder symptoms are usually not adequately assessed either, and there's kind of problems with the assessment criteria. So things can go amiss. Now, research suggests that eating problems and eating disorders are common in those seeking bariatric surgery, possibly because they may have engaged in serial dieting, which can be a precursor to disordered eating. And these are likely minimized or underreported by patients electing to have surgery due to the fear they will not be approved if they admit to an eating disorder or disordered eating. And what's really interesting is, regardless of weight, internalized weight stigma, which is kind of like an internal fat phobia, is correlated with both poor mental health and an increased pursuit of weight loss surgery. So the more uncomfortable someone feels in their body, the more they want to change their body or get out of it or get away from it because it doesn't feel safe or a good place to be. And guess what is promoted as the fastest and quote unquote best option to feeling better? Weight loss surgery. Research reports bariatric patients have the highest levels of internalized weight stigma, equivalent to those of psychiatric patients. And this shows up as significant levels of mood disorders, depression, anxiety, and poor quality of life. There's a link to more of this in a paper in the show notes. Yet surgeons promise the surgery will change lives forever. It's also seen as the last resort. So what happens when it doesn't help a person because it just doesn't work or because it can't, because it's not addressing the original problem? And there's an understandable desperation in these folk, hope, and big expectations the surgery is going to fix their physical and emotional problems. So what happens when the surgery doesn't do what they were told it would do? What about the fact that body dissatisfaction and poor body image is not cured by weight loss surgery? What about the feelings of isolation that arise because post-surgery folk can't do actually what they hoped they could do because the consequences of the surgery are life-changing? What happens when they can no longer eat normally because dinner only takes 2 to 3 minutes and you have to spend the remaining 30 to 40 minutes watching everyone else eat? What happens when post-surgery folk can't tolerate certain foods because the gut has been altered so much? And what if that leads to more dietary restrictions that are in fact just triggering for folk who have a history of disordered eating or an eating disorder? And here we're seeing that complications from weight loss surgery can include symptoms that exacerbate eating disorder behaviours, like vomiting, like diarrhea, like decreased appetite. And what happens when appetite just disappears, which it does? So folks struggle to eat enough to support their recovery and healing. Or when the hunger returns with such intensity, or they're so thirsty, but they don't have the stomach capacity to eat or drink to satisfy that need or want. The experience of loss of control while eating even small amounts of foods appears to be commonly reported among patients post-surgery. In fact, it's found in up to 39% of patients. So researchers have even now proposed a diagnosis of bariatric binge eating disorder to describe those patients who fulfill the diagnostic criteria, which is for DSM-5 for binge eating disorder, apart from the unusually large criteria for binge eating episodes when it comes to food intake. I've had numerous conversations with folk considering weight loss surgery, and they're stuck in this place of wanting to feel better in their body, but also feel very conflicted because they've said that eating the food is not the problem. They're not eating the wrong stuff, or they're not consistently eating too much. It's their emotional state. How is weight loss surgery going to help my emotional state or my binge eating, they've asked, which is a bloody great question. Some studies suggest that a diagnosis of binge eating disorder prior to surgery is associated with eating disorder symptoms after surgery, and less weight loss or more weight gain or regain occurs. So again, not sharing these facts is setting someone up for failure, surely. I was listening to some really interesting research into weight loss surgery and links to addiction. I learned this through listening to Food Psych, which is the podcast by Christy Harrison, who wrote Anti-Diet, and the link to this is in the show notes. It was in episode 139, and guest Lisa Dubril talked about how the brain still wants to be satisfied. And food is usually one of the big ways we can give ourselves satisfaction and pleasure. But when weight loss surgery removes that option for food to do that for us, maybe some folk become more vulnerable to seeking out pleasure elsewhere. And she talks about addiction, not with food, because she kind of debunks that, and other substances. And it's really interesting how it highlights the need and the importance and the role that food plays in giving us pleasure. Anyway, I'm kind of digressing, so let's come back to where I was, which is reduced appetite. And that can result in both malnutrition and dehydration. Because post-surgery, there's a much narrower window that you need to stay in order to stay well and be in with a chance of meeting your body's needs because your food intake is so small. So if you can only take in, let's say, a sip of water at a time, then if you go too long without drinking, it's not going to be easy just to play catch up without feeling totally shit. Like you could get in trouble, seriously dehydrated. And it's the same with eating. Malnutrition is a real problem. And there just isn't enough tracking of this in post-surgery patients. There's a condition called dumping syndrome, which essentially means the food moves through the gut too quickly because the stomach is so small and empties so and too quickly. So when food is eaten and it hits the small intestine, it creates kind of a massive fluid shift into the small intestine, which causes extreme diarrhea. Now, this is extremely uncomfortable and accompanied by sweating and nausea, intense fatigue. And it's perhaps most common after eating a higher sugar meal or consuming a larger meal, larger than your stomach can tolerate. But dumping is another disordered post-surgery behavior that is sometimes used to deliberately encourage weight loss or increase it, or to try to compensate for food eating when people are feeling out of control. And these sorts of very unpleasant experiences, I think, only reinforce any existing fears that these people may have around the food. Now, specific nutrient deficiencies certainly exist in post-bariatric patients that are usually much more rare in the general population. Now, without this tracking, it's really hard to see and get much data on this, but we know that iron and B vitamin deficiencies are the most common, and it's specifically the B1 and B12 deficiencies that can cause permanent neurological damage and negatively impact heart health. And there's also risks of deficiencies in zinc, selenium, calcium, magnesium, copper, and all the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. So the message I'm here is saying the body is going to be compromised for the rest of its life in how it absorbs nutrients. So folk need a kind of intense and personalised dietary and supplement regime. Now, you can't just go to your local health food shop or go to Boots and stock up on multivits. You have to be prepared to stay on top of this for the rest of your life, and that may require financial investment. There's a whole industry of bariatric supplements in the States, which basically looks like being put on a focused regime or diet of strict levels of protein, carb and fat, vitamins and mineral supplements. That is essentially another diet in order to meet their needs. And it's a different set of rules, but it's rules all the same. And these food rules may well have contributed to getting folk where they are now. So it gets messy. So in terms of this follow-up around malnutrition, we're not getting the long-term picture. Adding that surgical complications aren't logged after 30 days, how the hell are folks supposed to get the whole truth in order to make an informed decision? So if you're thinking of having this surgery, talk to folk that have had it. Talk to folk who are 5, 10, 15 years post-surgery to really find out the reality. Because there was a review of bariatric follow-up procedures back in 2014. Again, the link is in the show notes. And they looked at more than 7,000 studies. And you know what? Less than 1% of these 7,000 studies were decent where they followed up their patients. And I'm saying followed up more than half. We're looking at 80% of patients for more than 2 years. None of the other studies did this. So how can the bariatric surgery industry say it's safe and make all these promises? Well, they haven't got a bloody clue. So out of the 7,000 plus studies, they could only include 29 studies. So if we don't know what the long-term outcomes are, how scary is it to offer this to the masses without knowing? It's beyond belief for me. And when you do look at the well-designed studies that do report more of these consequences and side effects, you know what? Weight regain happens in 30 to 50% of cases, which raises the question for me, what happens when their body image doesn't get better? Or it gets worse, because for some it does. Because some of the cruel irony of this surgery is that dissatisfaction with body size that existed before the surgery may not be alleviated, but instead replaced by concern over loose skin, for example, which is also seen as highly socially unacceptable. Post-surgery recovery patients can therefore feel huge disappointment and failures because, hey, if things don't go well, diet culture makes sure to blame you. So this can make it really hard for folk to take care of themselves because feeling body hate and disgust is not a motivator for compassionate self-care. And we see higher rates of mental health issues post-surgery. Risk of suicide and self-harm has increased after weight loss surgery. So I think the take-home message here is, if you elect for weight loss surgery, there will be physical and emotional consequences, but you just won't know what these consequences or how much you'll have to pay for those. They will be. If you have an eating disorder and are contemplating bariatric surgery, it would be best to first receive eating disorder treatment, ideally from a therapist who practices from a health at every size approach and does not have a vested interest in your surgery decision. If you've had bariatric surgery and are experiencing any of the above things that I've talked about, you are strongly encouraged to seek help from an eating disorder specialist. Please hold on for the resources that I'm going to share in my pick and mix. I've opted for providing you with a reading list in my pick and mix for this episode. Whether this is to support you where you're at right now, perhaps you're considering weight loss surgery, have had weight loss surgery, or you know or are supporting someone else in this situation. The studies I've mentioned in this episode are provided in the show notes as hyperlinks, so they'll take you straight to them, and includes information about internalized weight stigma, bariatric surgery risks, follow-up, outcomes, understanding post-operative suicide, and self-injury and addiction. So I'm going to leave it there this time, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. If you've liked what you've heard, please do subscribe so you don't miss what's coming up in episode 10. If you'd like to carry on the conversation, please email me at mel@wakemannutrition.com or come find me on Instagram at Cake Over Keto, or I'm also at mel_wakeman_RNUTR. And don't forget, I'm on TikTok. I promise it's not just for young folk. The over 35s are the biggest growing demographic, did you know? So take care of yourselves. I will look forward to speaking to you next time. Bye-bye.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.